My name is Raja Khouri. I'm the CEO of Khouri Conversations, and I welcome you all to today's webinar titled How British Colonialism, Zionist Aggression, and Arab Incompetence Led to Today's Ravaged Middle East. We have a very special person with us today, our guest, Rami George Khouri, who I will be introducing shortly. We start as usual with the land acknowledgement. We are today on indigenous land and territories, known and unknown. We respect indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. As settlers and immigrants, we recognize that we have an active role in reconciliation. I would like to thank and acknowledge our partner in hosting today's conversation, the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and its chair, Peter Lawson, who is with us here. Thank you to our participants. These webinars are useless without you. A special welcome to participants tuning in from all over the country, as well as from the US, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. Isn't today's technology wonderful? Now, our conversations, for those who have been with us before, are not looking for winners and losers. We are looking for insight and understanding. And as I always like to say, most of our conversations are nonviolent and end without any casualties. So our format today is that Rami will be giving us some of his thoughts on this subject. Peter and I will be having a conversation with him, and then we will be opening the floor for Q&A. The chat box is open, but we will not be monitoring the chat box. Any questions you would like to address to Rami Khouri or any of us, please put them in the Q&A box. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. Welcome, Rami Khouri, Rami George Khouri. And despite both Rami and I having the same middle and last names, and we also share 2 letters of our first names, we are sadly not related. Rami George Khouri is the co-director of global engagement at the American University of Beirut, an internationally syndicated political columnist and book author, a professor of journalism and journalist in residence at the AUB, American University of Beirut, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was the first director and is now a senior fellow at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at AUB. He has been a journalist in the Middle East for 50 years and was awarded the Pax Christi International Peace Prize for 2006. I've known Rami a long time, and I'm really delighted to have him with us today. He's one of the very few people who can give you a really broad overview of what's going on in the Middle East, the region, in a very reasonable amount of time, which is saying something. Peter, did you want to say a few words at this point?
I'm thrilled to be here with both of you, and particularly with Raja Khouri, who I've read a lot about, haven't met before. Your reputation precedes you, and if you can answer the question that you've set out, I'll be thrilled. So thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing you.
You meant Rami Khouri. You said Raja Khouri.
Said Rami, that's right.
Because I'm not doing any of that. Rami, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you and your organizations for hosting me, and for all the people who've tuned in or who might watch this later. I deliberately chose a provocative title talking about British colonialism, Zionist aggression, and Arab incompetence as creating today's ravaged Middle East. So I'm a journalist by training. I masquerade as an academic these days, but basically I write things, I analyze things, I put my thoughts out there, and I do that to provoke a discussion that can lead to a constructive conclusion. I'm not out to just attack people or criticize them.
Excuse me, Rami. I'm having a little trouble with the sound. I see someone else say the audio is low. Can you either speak closer or turn up your volume?
Should I get close? I can get closer to the. I'm talking to my right into my computer. If I talk like this, is that better?
Marginally, but I see that several people are saying the same thing, so I do think we need to address it somehow.
Let me put in your phone and see if that works. That usually works better.
Raja, you got a suggestion here?
For some reason, my name is appearing on Rami's.
Yeah, that's why I was confused earlier. I said
well.
Rami instead of Raja.
If you give me
Okay, is this any better if I talk
Much
like
better, yes.
increasingly better, can you make me host, Peter? I will. I can fix that.
So
Okay.
that's going to cost you an extra sandwich at what's it called, Metzler's Delicatessen in Montreal that has the great sandwiches, where I've been several times.
You betcha.
Okay, so I chose this provocative title because I really think it's important for anybody who's interested in the Middle East or the Arab region or Israel or Palestine or any of these issues to take a moment to capture the totality of what's at stake, who's involved, and how we got here. We're at a very difficult moment in the Middle East. So my focus in my professional career, which is now 52 years old and still going, is that I have been a journalist most of the time, also doing some academic stuff, but I've been a journalist in the Middle East, writing about the region and its relations with the world, focusing heavily on Arab-Israeli issues because I am a Palestinian, but also on development issues in the region and other aspects. And what I've learned over this half century is that the forces that have brought the Middle East and particularly the Arab world to its current very difficult, very stressful conditions are forces that emanate from 4 or 5 different places. And I mentioned British colonialism and Zionist aggression as 2 of them, and then followed by Arab incompetence and state building and diplomacy and other things. So the point I want to make in the few minutes I have is that we have to go back to colonialism and the birth of Zionism, which for most Jews, not all Jews like it, but most Jews see Zionism as a great noble national endeavor, almost a miracle of reconstituting a Jewish state in their ancestral land. That's how Zionists see Zionism. But Palestinians see it as a catastrophe that has been going on for a century and is still going on with the conflict and the land expropriation and the killings and the jailings and all the things that are happening. So the key thing to remember is that this is 100 years conflict that has continued and is not being reduced. Israel is creating opportunities with people in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, but the core of the conflict is in the land of Israel and Palestine, and it's been going on since the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the things that made it happen, a critical thing that made it happen, was British colonial control of the region. The British, it was exactly 100 years ago in 1922 that the mandate for Palestine was issued by the League of Nations. And that was an extraordinary document. If people haven't read it, they should. It's available online. And it was a document in which the British government essentially said, we are going to take control of this land with the approval of the League of Nations. And written into the mandate was in the preamble, right at the beginning, is that one of the things we're going to do is create a situation that will bring about a national home for the Jewish people. And this was not a land that the British had authority to do. They didn't own the land. It wasn't their land. they were just a mandatory power taking care of it for the well-being of the people there. And the people there at that time were about 96%, 94% Arabs and about 6% Jewish. So there was an extraordinary distortion at the beginning of the colonial process, where the British in Palestine, working with Zionists who were extremely efficient at bringing about these British policies to support the Jewish national home idea. They were very successful, but it created a catastrophe for the Palestinians, so that by 1947, 48, when the British, as most colonials do, created a mess and couldn't solve it, got out and turned it over to the UN, and the UN made the partition plan, which the Arabs rejected because it was woefully unfair, and the Zionists loved it, and they created the state of Israel. So Israel was born in 1948, but in that process, around 750,000 Palestinians, half the Arab Palestinian population, was displaced. And that was the turning point, the critical moment, the fulcrum of the Arab-Israeli conflict as we know it. But it started back in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate. So you've got to go back to the colonial days, because not just because of the conflict in Palestine, but the conflict in Palestine echoed throughout the region and has continued to have echoes throughout the region. And in the critical period from the late 40s to the 1970s, one of the main reasons that Arab autocrats, mostly military officers, mostly incompetent military officers in the Arab region, took power and turned their countries into police states. One of the main reasons was they were saying, well, only we, the military, can protect our lands from more Israeli aggression. By then it was the state of Israel. So the repercussions of the Arab-Israeli conflict, of British colonialism, Zionism, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then the modern Arab world starting, say, in the 1950s until today, has been that we've seen a rash of autocratic Arab leaderships, many of them military, some civilian, some royal families that have a different kind of legitimacy. The royal families are not exactly the same as people like the Iraqi Ba'ath or the Syrian Ba'ath or the Egyptian military or Gaddafi in Libya. There's a difference, but all the Arab states, without exception, are non-democratic and have not done a very good job of development, have allowed this region to reach a stage where we really have three different Arab regions. There's about 430 million Arabs today. In 1930, there was about 60 million. So there's been massive growth in the population. But of today's 430 million Arabs, I would say about 15 to 20% are living very well. They're wealthy if they got their wealth through corruption or they worked for it fairly, doesn't matter, but about 15, 20% live well. They have insurance, they have bank accounts, they own their home, they're okay. About 20% are middle class. That middle class used to be about 40%. They're now about 20%, they're declining. And about 60, somewhere between 60 and 70% of people in the Arab countries are defined as poor, marginalized, and vulnerable by the UN and many other measures of poverty. People interested in this should look up something called the multidimensional poverty work, multidimensional poverty. There's a group in Oxford and other places, the UN works on this, and this has created a much more accurate measure of poverty, showing us that somewhere around 60 to 70% of people in the Arab region are multidimensionally poor. And that's not just poverty, meaning you don't have enough income to cover your expenses or you can't buy a car. It's also, we are now able to measure the hidden dimensions of poverty, the desperation, the fear, the uncertainty, the political repression, the lack of opportunity, the uncertainty about the future, lack of medical insurance, things of that nature. So the ravaged Arab region today is ravaged because it's had pretty incompetent governments leading it, with a lot of corruption. About 90% of people in Arab countries say that corruption is rampant in their societies. It's a huge number. And that perception is not a figment of their imagination. And so we've got this situation where you've got masses of population that are poor. None of them have political rights in any credible way. There isn't a single credible democracy in the Arab countries. There was a few that tried to bring it about in Lebanon and Tunisia and other places, but it wasn't serious and it didn't work. There are huge regressions in the basic social services that people need in health, education, water, social security. The fundamental foundations of a decent life are either stagnant or declining in most of the region. And I can give you lots of statistics, but they would probably bore you. But around 45 to 50% of Arabs in primary and secondary school cannot read and write. They graduate without being able to read and write. About only 30% of people in the Arab region have any kind of social security or insurance or health insurance or retirement funds. Something like 40 to 50% of young people who are the most productive, dynamic part of society want to immigrate. They want to get out and not come back. About 60%, now it's probably closer to 65 because of COVID and all that. About 60 to 65% of workers are in the informal sector. What that means is they have no contract, no insurance, no minimum wage, no safety requirements, that these are just people who are paid the equivalent of a few dollars a day for doing menial labor, and they have terrible vulnerability, and they form the chronic poor class that is now passing its poverty on from generation to generation. And this is one of the new things that's happening now. Poverty is not only expanding across the region, but it's become multi-generational, transgenerational. So if you're poor today, there's probably about a 96% chance you're going to be poor for the rest of your life, and your kids are going to be poor and their kids. That it's very difficult to break out of poverty now. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was easy. There's all kinds of schemes for jobs and training. Now that doesn't work. The world economy doesn't create the jobs that are needed. So this link between the colonial world, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the problems of the region today, the ravaged, hollowed out state of much of the Arab world, needs to be seen in that full context. There are some Arab countries that have done wonderful things. Many of you, including me, have been to Arab countries that have beautiful boulevards and nice houses and decent universities here and there, but that's the minority. The majority are living in a state of poverty, which leads then to humiliation, vulnerability, and alienation, that citizens are alienated not just from their government and their state, but they're alienated sometimes from the social systems of their own society. And these are the people that break off and go join a terrorist group, or ISIS, or Al-Qaeda, or they try to swim to Europe. They're desperate for anything to keep them alive. So this is the result of this process, is fragmentation of countries that once were pretty well integrated. Between the 40s and the 80s, most of the Arab countries were pretty solid, and they were doing some pretty decent state building. But that all stagnated and has started to reverse in the past 20 years or so. And I think if you go back over the last century, which I do repeatedly, and you try to analyze this, well, what are the big trends in the region that have brought us here? And I would mention 6. Number 1, without exception, is foreign military intervention. And this started with Napoleon. Some people want to go back to Alexander the Great, but let's just start in the modern world. So Napoleon, from 1798, I think it was, until today, there's nonstop foreign military intervention, and it's getting worse in the last 30 years than it has been in the past. So of course you have the US and in Iraq, and you had the French in various places. But now you've got more fighting going on. The Russians, the Turks, the Iranians, and Arab countries, and the Israelis, of course, bombing and killing people here and there when they feel it's in their national security interest. And now you've got Arab countries who are sending their troops around to different, or funding armies who, what do they call them? They fund armies who do the job for them, surrogate armies or militias in different countries. So the fighting in Libya, the fighting in Yemen, the fighting in Syria, lots of that is financed by different Arab countries, mostly the rich people in the Gulf. And so it's a free-for-all now. People are going around the region, fighting, taking pieces of land, creating different territorial configurations. Some countries are slowly breaking up here or there. You've had south of Sudan has gone, the north of Iraq is going to go, south of Yemen is probably going to go back to being independent or controlled by somebody else. So you have fragmentation of sovereignty, and this is one of the ultimate impacts of nonstop foreign military intervention. The second reason, so there's 6 reasons, I'll mention them quickly. The first one is nonstop foreign military intervention. The second is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the Arab-Israeli conflict, in my view, is the second main reason for the difficult conditions we have across our region today. In many different ways, the direct fighting between Israelis and Palestinians echoes around the region in public opinion, in anger, in resentment, and humiliation. And also it leads to massive military spending by corrupt Arab governments who can't fight well enough to fight the Israelis to a truce. In fact, the only one who has been able to do that is Hezbollah in many ways, ironically, not an Arab government, but an Arab movement supported by Iran. But the indirect impact of the Arab-Israeli conflict on wasted money, destruction of civilian infrastructures over many wars, et cetera, has been huge. The third reason is the nonstop autocratic governments in the Arab region that have become more authoritarian in recent years, and some of them have been hooking up with the Israelis to get some of their surveillance technology to become more authoritarian, to prevent their Arab citizens from even speaking out on social media. The fourth trend has been the erratic development. So there was a state building a few decades from the 40s to the 80s, and now it's going back, and I mentioned some of the statistics, and there's many, many other statistics. And the fifth reason has been accentuated in recent years. It's the resistance and the uprisings of citizens in the Arab world, not just people in Palestine resisting Zionism and the state of Israel, but people in Arab countries trying to get from their governments basic rights and basic decent services and basic decent governance. And they haven't been able to do it. This has been going on. I've watched this all my life from the 60s, 70s, 80s, strikes and protests here and there. And it finally erupted in 2010, 11 in the uprisings that we saw across the region. And some of them are still going on in Iraq and in Lebanon, Sudan, and Algeria in different forms. So popular citizen protests and uprisings is the fifth one. And the sixth trend that we see is the gradual, what I mentioned, the fragmentation of countries and the mass poverty and the economic stagnation. That's leading to what I call de-sovereignization, that countries that are sovereign independent states are in many cases losing some of their sovereignty. In other words, every Arab country today, without exception, every Arab country that wants to take a sovereign decision on what arms to buy, who to make an energy deal with, who to make a nuclear energy or nuclear power deal with, who to trade with, has to get the approval of some other power. It could be another Arab power. It could be a foreign power like the Americans or the Russians now. It could be Israel, in case if any Arab country wants to buy a fancy jet fighter plane, they've got to get the approval of the Israeli government. Otherwise, the US government isn't going to sell it to them, or others won't sell it to them. So there's a de-sovereignization going on. And the ultimate point here I make, and I should stop in a few minutes, is that the Arab region, broadly speaking, with exceptions, but most Arab countries have broadly failed the triple tests of the last century, and those are the tests of statehood, sovereignty, and citizenship. That we don't have stable states in most of the region, and if they're stable, they're only stable because of massive security controls. And this is, of course, the kind of stability the Shah had and Marcos had and the white apartheid South Africans had. That's not real stability. That's just authoritarianism. And most Arab countries don't have stable states. They don't have real sovereignty, and they don't have citizens with any real citizen rights. And this is the dilemma that the region is in now, having to grapple with all of these immense problems. And these are existential problems of giving your people enough water to just stay alive. You know, we're dealing with biological requirements, not ideological ones only. Food, water, shelter, education, medical care, jobs. These are challenges that most Arab countries are not able to meet. Even the wealthy ones, the oil producers, of course, can't meet these needs because they have to import massive amounts of foreign labor to do it for them, to do their work for them. So there is a real structural problem in the Arab region related to citizen rights, related to economic productivity, national integrity, and national development, sustained, equitable national development. We don't expect to become Switzerland overnight, but we should be better than we are now. And if you look at all the tables around the world that compare countries, we have the most inequality in the Arab region of anywhere in the world. Poverty grew faster in the Arab region than it did anywhere else in the world in the last 15 or 20 years, and on it goes. So if we look at these problems and we say, well, how did we get here? We got here because a colonial system that the British and French were mostly responsible for ultimately led to support for a Zionist movement that created the state of Israel, that sparked this nonstop war between Israelis and Palestinians and has engulfed the whole region in many ways. And those trends led to modern Arab states, contemporary Arab states, that cannot meet the basic needs of their citizens, neither in their material needs nor in issues of dignity and their identity and their feeling good about themselves. So it's not easy to solve this situation very quickly, given the large number of people in the Arab region are over 400 million, and the depth of these structural depth of these problems of unemployment, poor education, etc. There are ways out of this dilemma, of course, and that's one of the things I argue about, is that a fair Palestinian-Israeli peace, Arab-Israeli peace, that is fair to both sides, anchored in international law, respecting the fundamental needs of Israelis and Palestinians simultaneously and equally, not sequentially, not what the old Kissinger way and the Israeli dominant way of saying, well, first the Palestinians have to stop fighting for their rights and stop shooting us and killing us and bombing us, and then we'll see what we can give them. That doesn't work. People have been trying this for 40, 50 years. It doesn't work. The only peace that works is the kind that worked in South Africa, where a radical shift happens when enlightened leaders on both sides recognize that their system cannot continue, and they have to create a new system that is fair to both sides. You can only have a stable and lasting peace if it is an equitable peace. And in our case, it means Israelis and Palestinians must have their rights to statehood in that land recognized and must resolve their outstanding claims against each other, which can be done quite easily with the existing mechanisms we have in international law and conflict resolution and things of that nature. So I should stop here because we don't have a lot of time, but those are the broad points I wanted to make. So for those of you who keep following this situation, go back, read the 1922 mandate. And if you don't have it, I'll send a copy to Raja and he can put it on the website. It's a public document. It's not a secret. It's the League of Nations. Of course, the League of Nations fell apart because it wasn't very good. But before it fell apart, it created this really unfair, what I call criminal act of stealing the land of the Palestinians, where you had 94% Palestinian Arabs in Palestine, and essentially saying it's going to be given for a Jewish homeland. That just was not fair. It should never have happened that way. And there may have been other ways to create a homeland for the Jewish people that also did not uproot the Palestinians and bring a situation about today where there's 12 million, 13 million Palestinians in the world, of whom around 9.5 million are displaced or refugee people who are refugees or displaced from their original homes. And this continues today. The last point, this continues today. So we had a terrorist attack in Jerusalem, a terrorist attack against civilians, and that is what terrorism is defined as. And you had Israelis, settlers or soldiers shooting Palestinian teenagers in their home or in their school, and destruction of houses in the South Hebron Hills, Palestinian villages being completely destroyed by Israelis, and settlers going in there and also chopping down Palestinian olive trees. So both sides continue to fight each other, and we've got to find an equitable, permanent way to resolve this. So let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rami, for that. As usual, you managed to cram a lot of information and knowledge in a short time. And you know, I understood from what you said how these three things, you know, British colonialism, Zionist aggression or Israeli aggression, and then Arab incompetence contributed to where we are today. But do you draw a line between, you know, British colonialism and us having incompetent and you know, corrupt leaders?
You know, there is no distinct line that divides them, because the ruling systems in most Arab countries were pretty much created by the French and the British as they withdrew from the region. So if you look at Lebanon or Jordan or the Gulf countries or other places, those systems were pretty much put in place by the retreating colonial powers, who really weren't retreating. They were just disguising their manipulation of those societies, and they had local elites that they handpicked, and they put those elites in power. Some were royal families, like in Iraq, and some were not royal family. They were civilians, like in Lebanon. And then in other cases, military coups happened in places like Iraq and in Egypt and Libya, and so people came into power who did it by force. But the key point is that the ruling procedures and values of virtually all the Arab countries, with a few exceptions here and there, continue the pattern of what happened under the colonial rulers. Use of violence against civilians, non-consultation with the ordinary people, handpicked leaders and elites who were alienated from the citizenry as a whole, following policies that served the interests of the small elite or the foreign imperial colonial masters or powers back home. This system hasn't changed. We still live in a colonial, for most ordinary Arabs, they still live in 1910 or 1920 or 1930. The colonial pattern of of the exercise of power, the inadequate provision of rights to citizens, lack of consultation between governments and citizens, sovereign decisions taken for the well-being of the citizens of the country rather than some foreign power or some rich arms merchant. Those patterns were there in the colonial period and they continue. So this is a very important point. There's a brilliant British Iraqi writer called Zaid al-Ali who has done a lot of writing on constitutional issues. And he wrote a book, I think it's called Arab Constitutionalism. He has a chapter, and people should go buy and read that book, Zaid al-Ali, A-L-A-L-I, Arab Constitutionalism. And he talks about the transition from colonial to non-colonial to post-colonial, or post-colonial in quotes. And so this is one of our problems. And of course, the Israelis, the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians, the French, all the foreign parties who are involved, they support these elites, these non-democratic elites. And this perpetuates the problems that we had a century ago, and they continue to our day.
Peter?
You're muted.
You're muted, Peter. The phrase of the century.
Unmute myself. I'm sorry. I apologize. In your title, you focused on British colonialism, Zionism, and Arab incompetence. But in your list of 6 items, you talked. The top one was foreign intervention. Let me pitch a proposition to you, and you can react to it. That really today, it's all about oil. And if oil were to disappear tomorrow, or that green energy would eliminate the need for oil, then American interest in the region would evaporate pretty quickly, and they'd be off spending their energy somewhere else. So I guess, yeah, I'll put that. What do you think of that thesis?
I don't know enough about oil economies to really answer that with any coherence, but being an Arab journalist, I can talk about stuff I don't know anything about, and it's part of what we do, part of what all journalists do. But my feeling is there's probably a serious change that will happen when oil is no longer as important as it is today for basic energy, but that is still a ways down the road. So I wouldn't agree with you completely on that. The second thing I would say is that the seeds of this problem, the colonial and the Zionist Arabism, the conflict between Zionism and Arabism, started in the late 19th century, well before oil was discovered. And so oil aggravated things, created huge new scales of spending and development and whatever, and corruption, and created, of course, massive markets for Western military equipment, which regimes in the Arab countries who had the money bought it because they would buy anything that would help protect them and keep them in power, because they did not turn to their own people for their own validation. There isn't a single Arab government that has been validated by its own citizenry. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. And I'm not saying all Arab governments are bad. There are a few that have done some really good things for their people, especially some of the ones that had some money. But even the ones that didn't have a lot of money did some good things for their people in development terms. But that kind of stalled about 30 years ago. But it remains that we do not have a self-validated Arab pluralistic constitutional democracy. And we're the only region in the world that is collectively and chronically non-democratic. And this is there's something that explains that. And I tried to suggest some elements that might help us explain why that is. If you take Africa, South America, Asia, they have democracies, they have dictatorships, they have a bit of everything. We have only non-democratic countries, and most of them are slipping backwards now. So so that's my my answer to your question.
Thank
you. You know, a similar, I guess, type of intervention, and say, you know, you talk about the Arab world and the Arab countries. And I mean, I grew up in an Arab nationalist home, you know, Nasser and all the others. And when I came to Canada, I joined the Canadian Arab Federation, and you know, and then I co-started the Canadian Arab Institute. But in recent years, I started questioning this Arab thing, you know, and beginning to maybe think that, well, you know, are these Arab countries or Arabic-speaking countries? And, you know, the same way that Australia and the UK and Canada and the US are English-speaking countries, but they are, you know, they have some commonalities, some common interests, but they are very different societies.
Well, that's a very important point, and I think people recognize it more and more today. So an Arab is anybody who speaks Arabic. That's easy. Anybody who speaks Arabic is an Arab. And there are countries that created the Arab League, because there are countries where the majority of people speak Arabic. So, but not all the citizens are identify themselves as Arabs, say ethnically or politically or in other ways, and they speak other languages. You have the Amazigh and the Berbers in North Africa. You have the Kurds. You have Circassians. You have Armenians. There's all kinds of minorities that speak other languages as well as Arabic. So this is to be an Arab is an issue that is still being debated. What does it mean to be an Arab? And this is one of the interesting ways in which the Zionist Arabist, so I talk of the Zionist Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian, the Israeli-Arab. There's many ways you can define this conflict. But the conflict between Zionism and Arabism, which is the broader regional one, is there because a lot of people across the region who don't live right around Israel and Palestine. So the Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, they've all directly suffered the repercussions of the Palestinian-Israeli wars, bombing and occupation and all that. But people in Algeria and Tunisia and the Gulf, they don't live right in the area. They don't directly feel the impact of the conflict, but they feel the emotional, psychological impact of the conflict. They feel that, first of all, and this is why public opinion across the region routinely says about 80 to 85% of people in the Arab countries say they support the Palestine cause. They want a peaceful settlement. They will not have normal relations with the Israelis until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved. That's why there's a lot of support for the Palestinian rights cause across the region. And among the people, the governments are very different because these governments are not anchored in the will of their own people. But this is an important point that people across the region have felt for the last 50, 60, 70 years, the vulnerability that maybe the Israelis are going to come and occupy us. I mean, they annexed part of Syria, they've expanded settlements, they've taken over old Jerusalem. So the threat that many ordinary Arabs feel is not just a military threat of annexation or occupation, but it's also a kind of humiliation that all these wealthy people in the Arab world, all these people with money and oil and these big armies could not stop the plan that the Zionists created back in 1915, 1920 with Balfour, and the plan succeeded. The Zionists were extremely able in many different ways to achieve their goals. They created a Jewish majority Zionist Israeli state, which exists and has expanded. So this is an important element to keep in mind, that one of the reasons Nasser was able to whip up this frenzy of Arabism was to help people feel, well, we're going to be able to stop this Israeli threat. Of course, he wasn't able to do it, but that's a different point.
Peter, anything from you?
Looking forward, we have a very uncertain world. You painted a broad picture about the region, but the region is also influenced by broad kind of tectonic shifts. China, Russia and the United States in particular. Any thoughts on how that might possibly influence the evolution of the region?
It will influence it, but we don't, it's hard to tell how. First of all, the dominance in the region that had been enjoyed by the British and the French a century ago was replaced by the Americans and the Soviets. And now the British and the French are receding a bit. The Americans don't quite seem to know what they're doing. They want to be in the region, but they want to not get stuck in wars and stuff. The Russians are deeply involved in Syria and other places and are happy to go around bombing people as they're doing in Ukraine and Syria and other places. But at the same time, they feel they benefit from those relationships. So the Russian involvement in the region is expanding. The Iranians now, the Russians are uniting their electricity grids, which is a pretty significant step. And so the Russians are going to be more active, or going to try to be more active if they can prove themselves to be competent and desirable partners. The Chinese and the Indians are the really big question marks that we don't know. Question marks only in the sense that we don't know if they want to get more involved in the region beyond trading. So I've said for years, one of the phrases that I'm proud of having coined is that the Americans always look at our region, still do today. They look at us as targets or markets, targets to bomb or markets to trade with or sell us stuff. We're either targets or we're markets. With the Chinese and the Indians, they definitely want to trade. They want to have relations where they send workers, they sell us materials, they buy raw materials from us. They want to have deeper economic relationships, but there's no sense of the Chinese or the Indians wanting to be more involved politically. They have enough issues to deal with in their own spheres. So I think it's too early to gauge what will be the impact of greater Chinese involvement. Personally, I would welcome it because the Chinese seem to be rather non-ideological in their foreign policies beyond the ideology of improving their economic conditions, but they understand that they can only improve their economy by improving our economies, and that's why they have this Belt and Road process to help countries all over between Europe, Asia, and China to have a smooth mechanism to trade and ship materials in both directions.
I'm looking at now some of the questions coming in from our participants, and a reminder to put your questions, folks, in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. We're not checking that one. I'm going to combine 2 or 3 questions into one, and that is, if you are still advocating for a 2-state solution when you talk about Arab-Palestinian peace, Israeli-Palestinian peace, and is it possible still to do that? And your comment earlier about the Arab-Israeli conflict being central to resolving the problems of the Arab countries, why is that so?
I'll answer the first one first. I'm not saying it's central. I'm saying that if we could resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict peacefully, especially the Palestinian Zionist conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, if that could be resolved peacefully, which is the first question I'll get to, but if we can resolve that, it will have significant positive impacts across the regions. For instance, one of the main reasons the Iranians and the Israelis are at loggerheads is because of Palestine. And Lebanon, of course, with Hezbollah linked to Iran, the Palestine issue created an opportunity for the Israeli occupation and subjugation of Palestine and South Lebanon created opportunities for the rise of Hamas and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is heavily linked to Iran. So if there were no Arab-Israeli conflict, if it was resolved, the Iranians would not have that reason to want to be in the region. They might try to find other reasons, but they probably would not be supported by most people in the region, because I can tell you most people in the region don't want to live under an Iranian-style regime. So that's just one example. Also, it would reduce the ability of the dictators to control power in Arab countries and say we have to be in power because we're going to fight the Zionists and the Israelis. And so it would have strong repercussions, and it would open up trade and massive cooperation in natural resources, water, trade, education, climate, environmental issues. So that's what I'm saying. It would have huge positive impacts. There are other reasons why people are fighting in the region. It's not just because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But to answer question number one, it's very difficult now to see how we're going to get a two-state solution based on the parameters that most people understand it to mean, which is the Clinton parameters. In other words, the Israelis get out of most of the West Bank and with border exchanges here and there, and the Palestinians end up with their state. This also has to be done in the Golan Heights at some point, but that's far away right now. That's for the Syrians and the Israelis to negotiate. But a two-state solution is very difficult to imagine happening right now, but it's not impossible. You know, the thing that I always say is this: the Israeli citizenry is moving to the right much more, as we just saw with the last 5 elections. And the settlers are doing anything they want. They're in the government. Many parts of the Arab world are becoming more conservative and more militant. And so the trends on both sides are not very happy, I think, for a peaceful resolution. But there were situations in my lifetime that I remember, you know, the Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, what he did. He woke up one day and he realized that his system was unsustainable. And so he changed it. And it's not to say that what we have with Putin now is great, but he changed that old Soviet system into something that at one point had a chance to try to develop more democratically, and it didn't for various reasons. And you had South Africa, which, again, you had 2 amazing leaders, F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela, who realized that what they were involved in was unsustainable and unjust. And they changed it overnight. The people in Northern Ireland realized at some point that they had to find a nonviolent resolution to their conflict. Now, those did not involve big territorial returning territory and stuff. That's where the complexity comes in. But there's a lot of people working on options for how do you have an Israeli state and a Palestinian state that have equal rights, that give their people what their people demand and expect and deserve in terms of security, opportunity, voice, etc., etc. How do you achieve that? You might have a lot of the Israeli settlements on the border stay where they are, which is likely to happen. And the smaller Israeli settlements inside the West Bank would be pulled out, which the Israelis have done before. They got out of Gaza, they got out of Sinai. They know how to get out of settlements as well as how to get into them, when they realize that it's in their best interest. And this is the critical point. This is the critical point. A peace process, 2-state, 1-state, dual states, whatever kind of relationship between Israelis and Palestinians might happen, has to, first of all, give both sides the basic demands that they demand. Their basic demands, their most important existential demands, have to be met. And I believe they can be met. I've done research on this, and there's many ways that you can give the Israelis what they want, which is to be recognized in the region and to live in peace as a Jewish majority state, which they are now. Now, that can be done. In fact, the Arabs have all essentially said that the Israelis were willing to do this. The Palestinians need to get the same thing. So you've got to get equal rights for both sides that meet their existential bottom line and happen simultaneously, not sequentially. Because those 3 conditions have not been met, the fighting continues, the settler rampages, the Palestinian bombs in Jerusalem, the the boycotts, the this, the that. Oh, this is warfare. We're in a war, and if people acknowledge that we're in a war, they're going to constantly be surprised. Why do people say this and why do they do that? Well, they say this and do that because they're in a war. And when people are in a war, they do terrible things to each other. And this is what Israelis and Palestinians are doing. The possibility of achieving a peace is only going to happen when a credible, serious international mediator steps in. And there is no person right now that can play that role. It's possible this might change down the road. The Americans have had about 40 years of marshaling the peace process, and there's been no peace, no real peace. The peripheries, Jordan, Egypt, governments in the Gulf, Morocco, they've reached agreements with Israel, but the core of the problem is still there. And the majority of people in the Arab world will not make peace with Israel under these conditions of occupation, subjugation, colonization, incarceration, mass assassination, all the things that the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. People in the Arab world just won't accept it. They will not roll over and die or submit. But they keep saying we will live with in polls all over the region. The majorities of people in the Arab world say they will live peacefully with Israel. The governments have all said this. If the Israelis give the Palestinians the rights they deserve, a mediator has to step in and do that task. It's not going to happen with Abu Mazen and Netanyahu. The Palestinians essentially don't have a government. Abu Mazen and his government are totally moribund. They have very little credibility. The Israelis have a very fervent right-wing, nationalist, Zionist government, and militant increasingly with links to settlers. So these people are not going to find anything by themselves that's going to bring about a peace agreement. But I don't rule out the possibility that it can happen, because in all conflicts in the world, eventually things change. Conditions in the region change. And we can't predict what's going to happen 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. But I think we don't give up hope, but also we don't stop working. We keep trying to explore where is the opening, where the majority of Israelis and majority of Palestinians will agree on an arrangement that satisfies them both. So that's going on all the time, quietly behind the scenes, but it has not yet really brought in any serious, powerful external mediator that can do that essential mediation role.
Peter, you got your eye on any questions from the audience?
I'm sorry, I was so engrossed with listening to our speaker that I didn't I didn't do my job of looking at the questions and answers. There are quite a few, and I notice we're out of time already. But
we're not actually. We're going until 6:45.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. There are a couple of ones that are sort of hard from people who don't accept your thesis. So let me do a couple here. I'll pull up someone. The pay for slay program, which has been widely touted, mostly by the Israeli side. I think the question is, how can it possibly contribute to peaceful resolution?
What's the called pay?
So it's this program that is labeled pay for slay by the Israelis, by the Zionists, that it basically is, as I understand it, a program where the Palestinian Authority pays the families of people who are incarcerated by Israel on the accusation of terrorism. And that I've heard many people refer to that as sort of a terrible thing, and I want to know, maybe you're not aware of it, in which case you're not able to respond to it.
Oh, no, I'm aware of that program. Yeah, it's this is part of what goes on in warfare. I keep telling, I'm not saying that what people were jailed for is necessarily something I accept. So if somebody was jailed for a bomb that was placed in a school or a pizza parlor in Tel Aviv, then I'm not saying that that's good or acceptable. I'm saying it's inevitable when the situation is as it is now between these two people. And the Palestinian government has an obligation to take care of its citizens. If somebody's in jail, that family's not earning money, they probably need money to live. I imagine that's why they do it. And the prisoners, by the way, in Palestine, the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails are a significant political actor in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They have actually come up with consensus agreements among the political leaders in jail on what we need to do as a Palestinian government to deal with the Israelis peacefully, negotiations, whatever may happen. So there's the Palestinian governments that pay families to continue staying alive don't see themselves as being involved in criminal activity, but being involved in fundamental humanitarian obligations of a state. So the question is, the bigger question that should be asked is, why were those Palestinians involved in activities that got them put into jail? What is the root cause of this conflict that persists after 100 years that causes both sides to do terrible criminal deeds, in some cases terroristic deeds? That's the real question. Why does the Israeli government let a settler who kills a Palestinian child out of jail 4 months after he's put in jail for killing a Palestinian child? And this happens routinely. Or something like 95% of complaints by Palestinians against Israeli settlers or Israeli army troops in the occupied areas are not even brought to court or investigated in any serious way. So there are questions of equal magnitude on both sides related to acts of military or criminal attacks against the other. It's easy for one side or the other to point out something and say, well, why do they do that? What's wrong with these people? That has been the approach that's been used in the last 50, 60 years, and it's gotten us to where we are today, where people walking in West Jerusalem, in the Israeli part of the city, suddenly a bomb explodes. Or Palestinians are out trying to harvest their grapes, their olives, outside of Nablus or Bethlehem, and suddenly a gang of 20 armed settlers from New Jersey or wherever come down and cut their trees and shoot them or beat them up. So, these kinds of dynamics are dynamics of perpetual warfare. And we need anybody who's seriously interested in this, with the objective of satisfying their national rights and living in peace with the people who are fighting them, has to look at both dimensions. If they just look at one side, then they should go and work for an American television station, because that's what they do. It's political entertainment, not seriously trying to examine what is the cause of this conflict, what are the positions, how to resolve it. So that's my answer to that question.
I noticed some people have sort of virtually raised their hand, and I'm sorry, we're not prepared to accommodate raised hands. If you have something to ask, please put it in the Q&A. And Rami, many Palestinian, mostly intellectuals, especially in the diaspora, have been, talking about, forget about the two states, it's not going to happen. We want one state that recognizes rights for both. From the river to the sea, everybody should be free. That kind of talk that a lot of people in the Jewish community feel threatened by. First, is this pie in the sky? I mean, is it within the realm of the possible for there to be one state with democratic rights for all? And how do we sort of reassure people who think one state means another sort of another Holocaust, another Nakba, another Jewish Nakba, so to speak.
A one-state solution is not going to happen soon. I think it's very difficult under the present circumstances. I think it's inevitable in the longer run for various reasons, political, technical, environmental. I think eventually you're going to have some kind of confederal arrangement between Palestine, Israel, maybe Lebanon, maybe Jordan, who knows? Because these countries are still evolving, and we don't know what Lebanon is going to be in 30 years, or Jordan, or but Israel and Palestine eventually must be linked in some kind of symbiotic relationship that encourages them both to maintain the peace and strengthen the perceptions of both sides that they can live together as peaceful neighbors, as they used to do before 1929 or so, when you had the first eruption of fighting between the first big eruption between Israelis and Zionists, and before the state of Israel, there was Jewish groups, Zionist groups, and Palestinians there. But if you go back to the region, not just in Palestine, by the way, I spent many years in Lebanon. I've visited Damascus often. When you go around the region, every Arab city has a Jewish quarter, and there are synagogues that are still there. And I remember walking in Beirut many times to work past a shop called Mizrahi, which is an Israeli Jewish name. There are Arab Jews. And I have a few that I personally know, Lebanese Jews are very close friends. And so Judaism was part of the fabric of our societies before Zionism. And this is why the Zionist colonial combine was such a provocative dynamic that upset the region in many ways, and there's many other things in the region that created problems. I'm not putting all the blame on the colonials and the Zionists, but in Palestine, the situation changed. Now, but the point is that Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived together in relative harmony for a long time in Palestine and in Lebanon and other Arab countries. And it's a shame that most of the Arab countries, except for Morocco, have lost their Jewish populations, because they were an important part of the intellectual and cultural and political and commercial fabric, and especially in places like Baghdad and Damascus and Beirut. So in the long run, yes, I think it can happen, and I think it must happen. But in the short run, they have to be separated. There's too much anger, too much blood, too much resentment, too much desire for revenge. Too many people have suffered brutally on both sides to be able to suddenly say, okay, we're now citizens of a single state. That can't happen soon. So there has to be separation, and there has to be a transition period, and not under a mandate of colonial criminals like the British were, but it has to be a international involvement that is ethical, impartial, consistent, and humane. And I think we can find people around the world who will play that role. But it's going to take a long time. We've had 100 years of this conflict. We don't need 100 years to solve it, but it's not going to be solved in 10 or 50 years. So we have to look incrementally at how this can be resolved. And in the short run, there's very little positive that we can see, but nothing happens in the short run. Things always happen in the long run. And so again, if you look at South Africa, the former Soviet Empire, Northern Ireland, other places in the world that had terrible situations, and they changed over time. And they changed for different reasons: economic pressures, ideological changes, environment, demography. There's many reasons why conditions change, and they will change in this region. I have no doubt. about it. I can tell you one other thing is that I've spent my whole life in the Middle East, often interacting with, well, always interacting with my Jewish friends all over the world, but interacting with Israelis, especially after the Israeli-Jordan peace agreement when I lived in Jordan. And I can tell you that the vast majority of Arabs and Israelis, as far as I've experienced them, can live together very easily, very peacefully. It's the extremist elements that, and I'm being very careful in the words I use here, it's the extremist elements that came in with the colonial and the Zionist movements that wanted to create an exclusive ethnic Jewish state on a land where the Jews made up around 5-6% of the population. Suddenly, that created a terrible dysfunction and leading to the conflicts we have now. And on the Arab side, you have today extremist militant groups that will refuse to do anything other than regain control of the land for the Arabs. But even the extremist groups, like Hamas, for instance, they've made it clear that they're willing to live in a two-state kind of arrangement as long as the Palestinians get their rights. And this raises really important points about refugee rights. It's not just withdrawing from the land that is people occupied. It's also dealing with rights that refugees had, restitution of their property. For instance, I have family members whose families have whose family members own huge pieces of land in what is now Tel Aviv, and we didn't sell them that land. We didn't rent it to them. They just took it in a war, and so that has to be addressed. And people on the Israeli side will say, well, what about the property that Jews had in Baghdad and other Arab countries? And my response is that has to be addressed as well, but it can only be addressed according to a single standard of law and morality. We are prepared to do that. We on the Arab side are saying we want a single law that applies to the totality of this conflict, that Israelis and Palestinians and Iraqis and Lebanese cannot be treated according to two different standards. This is what Zionism has tried to do. Zionism says Jews have a priori and greater immediate right to this land for reasons that they come up with, and British colonial officers bought it, and off they went, and they succeeded. But we see the result. There has to be an ethical, legal, political mechanism that recognizes the rights of both sides simultaneously and to the same magnitude. So this is going to take a long time, and therefore we say, if Israelis want or Jews want to say, look, I own the apartment in Baghdad, or I own the piece of land in Lebanon, I need to get that back or negotiate a restitution of it or something. My answer is absolutely. People who have legitimate claims have to put those claims on the table, and the mechanism to adjudicate them has to be worked out. And people have looked at this for years, and there's many ways it can be done. It's a technical issue. Once the political will to do it is there, it can be done. And I hope it happens one day.
I wanted to ask you about Tunisia, but we are out of time. Peter, over to you for some closing remarks.
Well, I just want to, first of all, thank you, Rami, for spending the time with us today. You've really covered a broad horizon in the Arab world. I'm afraid you've opened more questions than you've provided answers, so maybe it requires further discussion. I was sorry that we didn't get onto the whole issue of your assessment of settler colonialism, but that will perhaps be for a future discussion. So thank you very much for spending the time with us today. And thank you, Raja, for being my partner in this.
Likewise, Peter.
Well, thank you to both of you and for all the people who tuned in, and may we have better days ahead.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Ma salama.
Allah salmak.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.